Hey guys, so Emilie just came out yesterday, the new Dendro polearm sub DPS, and I spent hours yesterday on stream testing Emilie in almost every team possible. And I was also testing both old teams and new teams, one after the other, in order to A/B test and compare both the clear times and the user experience. But if you want the quick answer, the issue is whilst I found her fun, I really like her design and I found her good in a bunch of teams. Although she was good in teams, I couldn't actually find any current team where she felt best in slot anywhere. Meaning I couldn't find any current team where she definitely felt like an upgrade. And you might be like, how is that possible? You might have heard she was a DPS increase in this team or that team, but this is just what I've tested. But I've been thinking about this, and one factor is that my build is very relatable. I'm using Favlance. I don't have her signature. I have a pretty good about 32 user sub stats unfinished reverie set, and I switched that between a pretty good deepwood memory set as well. But her signature is a massive increase to her damage, and she actually really doesn't have many options, because one of your other valid options is an event weapon, Missive Wind Spear, who many people won't have. And I'm kind of worried that since Emilie is a sub DPS rather than a team buffer, almost all of her value is in bringing that damage. So I'm worried she is reliant on her signature in order to be a best in slot support, at least with current teams. Okay, first of all, what does Emilie do? She's actually very simple. I would say her elemental skill is very similar to Yaimiko, and her burst is very similar to Kokomi's burst. So with Yaimiko, you gain levels on her skill through using all three of her skills. But with Emilie, you gain levels on this totem by having burning done in your team. And you can see her attack speed goes up, maybe her damage goes up as well. And like Kokomi, what her burst does is it refreshes her skill, which is very simple to understand. She can be played in teams without burning, which I'll get into later in the video, like Nilou teams. But the bulk of her value is getting those burning reactions, so you are able to get as much damage as possible from her. The next thing that is really helpful is comparing her with other Dendro characters, and it is important to know the past issues with pyro-dendro teams. I've talked about this in previous videos before, but basically in 3.0, when the new Dendro reactions came out, they actually kind of subtly didn't want us to play pyro-dendro teams. You can see here Pyro Traveler. This pyro reaction here is basically the worst one because his lamp explodes compared to the Hydro and Electro reactions, which gain valuable effects here. And the same thing happened with Nahida. You can see the pyro one here is just extra damage for her, and it's clearly the worst one. And not just that, when you look at like aggravate, spread, those reactions increase your whole team's damage. Obviously Hyper Bloom teams, I don't need to go into too much detail. They've been very good for a long time. And in comparison, people have not really been playing Burning or Burgeon. There just hasn't really been enough value or reason to play those. And like I said, many of the existing Dendro options just didn't really want you to play those teams in the first place. Even the DPSs like Tainari and Alhaitham, they clearly benefit from Dendro Electro reactions, and they don't really care about Dendro Pyro. Also, Nahida in particular. And as you know, honestly, Nahida is insanely unbalanced for Dendro teams. I would even go as far as to say as she almost has zero flaws. She's almost the perfect Dendro character. She only really has one, maybe two weaknesses. The biggest one is the one that people have been talking about for a long time. It's that she's not very good in multi-wave fights. That's because her skill, you need to reapply this mark every time new enemies spawn in, which can interfere with the rest of your team. Like you have to switch off your on-field DPS in order to switch back to Nahida and reapply her skill. As you know, that's been very annoying with DPSs like Sino. And the second one, to be completely honest, her damage outside of spread is not very high. And basically these two things are what Emilie solves. She doesn't care about spread, so she can be played in these other Dendro teams. And also it's very simple for her skill to have very high uptime. You can't really go wrong with this, and this can give her a big advantage over Nahida in multi-wave AoE fights. Okay, so how to build Emilie. So for her artifact set, I've actually done some rough calcs. Basically, Unfinished Reverie is strong enough to match Deepwood Memory's Res Shred. Deepwood Memories is usually a very popular option for Dendro characters, because you get the dendro damage here and you reduce enemies resistance by 30. This is a lot, but this 50% extra damage in burning teams, as you can see, it basically cancels out Deepwood Memories. Now if you can have another teammate who uses Deepwood Memories for that resistance shred, and you give Emilie Unfinished Reverie, then as you can see, it would be a huge upgrade. However, I'm actually concerned that most people and most teams won't have a suitable user for that. It just doesn't seem like a common occurrence. The most likely teammates would be someone like Nahida or Zhongli, but I don't know how popular double dendro teams will be with Emilie. And as for Zhongli, I don't know how common it would be for players to use his artifact set to buff Emilie's sub DPS damage rather than buffing their main DPS with something like Archaic Petra, Instructor, or Tenacity of the Millilith. So if you ignore that, as you can see, both sets are very similar. So it kind of just comes down to substats, which set has the better substats. Now I would assume it's more likely for players to have better Deepwood Memories pieces. So I would guess Deepwood Memories will be her most popular set overall, but you might have very good pieces of the new set. So just use whichever set. Now as for the weapon, as I discussed earlier in the video, biggest issue is she doesn't have many 4-star weapon options. And I think most players will be stuck with something like Favonius Lance. Now I haven't been able to do calcs myself, but I have seen other people's calcs, and her signature weapon is a significant upgrade, and it basically combines both a DPS weapon and Favlance's energy, at least for herself. You can use Missive Wind Spear if you have it. It's one of the few polearms that actually give attack, but I know many people won't have this. And you could also use something like Deathmatch, but Deathmatch is literally pay to win. You can only get it from the battle pass, so free-to-play players won't have it. As I said earlier, I think this weapon issue is pretty huge, to be honest. Calcs only tell one part of the story. I still have to do a lot of testing, but her signature weapon might be very important. But it will take some time. We need to do more testing. It also depends on how her meta develops and whether her popular teams are using her more for the burning synergy, and whether her sub DPS is just an extra bonus, maybe something like a Neuvillette team, or whether many players are playing teams where her sub DPS is very critical for her spot in the team, which would make her signature weapon much more important. Okay, let's get into all the teams I tested. The first team I'll start off with is a burning team, because I think it can be very important to know how Emilie can buff teams through artifact sets. Let's take Klee Mono Pyro for example. Now if Emilie was to replace Xiangling in this team, as we know, Emilie doesn't actually provide any team buffs by herself, whereas Xiangling, you get this 10% attack pepper here. You have a C1 with 15% pyro res, and you have a C6 with 15% damage bonus. And looking at my calcs, ignoring the attack pepper, just the C1 and C6, Xiangling can give about 15% total damage to a pyro DPS. But this is where it gets cool, because someone like Klee, when you play her in mono pyro, she's just using a mixed artifact set. But what can happen is with Emilie, you can actually upgrade your character's set to Unfinished Reverie, which is basically the mixed set, 18% attack, but you get an extra 35% damage. And this is very important for team building, which is why I wanted to start off with this team, because this set is worded that it can be used on the whole team in a burning team, not just the dendro. As you can see in my rough calcs, with this artifact upgrade, you actually make up the buffs you lost by using Emilie. It's basically the same damage. And at this point, it comes down to whether Xiangling's personal damage will get out damaged by Emilie's personal damage, and I guess the small extra burning damage you might get, which is all very possible. There is also other factors, like Xiangling, you have 3 pyro characters, so you might have less energy issues, or Emilie might have less rotational issues because she has short burst cooldowns, low burst costs. But overall, this artifact upgrade situation is not just with Klee, it can apply to many other characters who don't have a strong artifact set. And you can see how Emilie almost acts how Farina acts, where Farina lets a lot of characters use the Marechaussee Hunter set. Now obviously other burning DPSs like Arlecchino or Linny instead of Klee, those characters can already have access to the OP artifact sets within their own kit, so it wouldn't help them much. But being able to use these overpowered modern artifact sets can be a very nice buff to some characters. And when I compare this new burning team to the old mono pyro team in the Abyss, it actually felt pretty similar in single target. I just wasn't able to get it better than Xiangling in the AoE. But these sorts of mono pyro to burning teams comparisons, these were some of the closest comparisons in terms of clear times. and you could argue Emilie is a lot easier to play than Xiangling. Next teams I was trying was Neuvillette Vape teams, either with Kazuha or with Zhongli, and we were mainly checking whether these teams were an upgrade to the teams with both Kazuha and Zhongli. And technically with Xiangling and Kazuha's high pyro app, you can actually play both Farina and Neuvillette, so there was these teams as well. Now again, in my experience, these teams with Emilie weren't getting faster clears and they weren't more optimal damage wise, and honestly, I think it's quite obvious. As you know, Emilie doesn't buff Neuvillette, and in a lot of Neuvillette teams, basically, Neuvillette is so strong that usually you want all his teammates to just buff his damage, and that's how you get the most success. So Zhongli, Kazuha, Xiangling, they all buff his damage. If you use Farina, she would also buff his damage. And even without constellations, Neuvillette just works so well as a hyper carry that the old teams work better. However, I will say the Emilie teams are much more easier to set up, because you don't have to worry about swirls and archaic petra on Zhongli. You just use everyone's abilities. As long as you start with Neuvillette and then you use either your Kazuha or your Zhongli just to ensure that first hydro reaction, then after that you can kind of just do what you want. So that's an advantage there. You could say Emilie's easier to play. However, I have to give a counterpoint that although Emilie might be easier to play in terms of setups, you also have to factor in that you're sacrificing other forms of easy to play. Like Kazuha's grouping can make the team feel easy to play. Zhongli's shielding can make the team feel easier to play. And if you're playing Farina, she can provide energy to Neuvillette and she can provide sustained damage, making these teams feel easy to play. There's lots of different perspectives. Although Emilie was okay, it's just hard for me to say Emilie was an upgrade. I was also trying Melt teams. I was trying Wriothesley teams with Emilie and Ganyu teams with Emilie. Now, first of all, the Wriothesley teams, I was using him at C1, R1. I think the jury's still out. I personally didn't find these teams that strong. It didn't feel like an improvement over Farina. In fact, it actually kind of felt a bit more clunky than the Farina teams. And that's probably because with Farina, a lot more of her power budget is in buffing the team, whereas Emilie's is just in the pure damage, which means you really have to build Emilie, Wriothesley and Xiangling in these teams to see good value. Whereas with Farina, she has access to free-to-play weapons. You don't have to invest in her that much. And if you have a good Wriothesley, a good Xiangling, you can just see more value and it can just feel more smoother to play. But let me know if you found the new Wriothesley teams easier to play. The jury's still out. Let me know if you had a different experience. But on the other hand, the Ganyu teams were much more interesting for me because it wasn't just about comparing Emilie versus Nahida. I also spent a lot of time comparing her versus Xiangling Kazuha and Xiangling Zhongli. So there was a lot of different Ganyu teams and I was able to see the value of each of them. The thing with the Ganyu teams is that they all kind of solve their own problems. So this is the oldest Ganyu team and we got some decent clears. This is kind of the easiest team to play in terms of you can't get hit with Zhongli's shield. You got some decent pyro application. It's just very straightforward to play. The issue with this team is that it has basically the lowest damage ceiling. Now you can increase that damage ceiling with Kazuha, and this is the team that I got the fastest clears on. And to be honest, although this team doesn't have a shield, in a way it can also feel easier to play because you have the grouping here and you have Kazuha's extra pyro app, so you're less reliant on just Xiangling's pyronado. Now the other old team we obviously tested was with Nahida. Now the advantage Nahida has in this team is that she can have a buffing weapon here like Wandering Evenstar or TTDS. I use Wandering Evenstar in my gameplay, and she also can use Tenacity of the Millith 4-piece set for an extra 20% attack to Ganyu. Again, that gives her an advantage over Emilie because Emilie can't use a buffing weapon or artifact. And I had pretty good gameplay with this Nahida team as well. I will say though that this Nahida team requires a lot more finesse. You have to be very precise with your setups. You have to know how to navigate, and that's probably the strength of using Emilie instead. Although it didn't feel like a damage increase because you're losing all those buffs on Ganyu, and Emilie tries to make that up by bringing in her own damage. But I think at best it's only able to match what Nahida was bringing. Although she is easier to play, but as you can see, at least optimally, she wasn't actually bringing faster clears. Now, if you do want to play this team, I think this is the team I'd only really recommend. You really want to use another pyro applier here, and I think Kazuha is much better than using someone like Xiangling, just because you get the grouping with Kazuha and you can buff your Ganyu. So yeah, Emilie makes setup straightforward, but does she make the teams more straightforward than this old team? I don't think so. And do the teams do as much damage as using Kazuha instead? And you get the grouping? I don't think so either. So it was hard for me to say Emilie was an upgrade here, but you can still justify playing this team. It was still a pretty solid team. Now next teams, I know a lot of people would have been interested in this, which is, can you play Emilie in Nilou Bloom teams? And the answer is yes, you can. As long as you understand without the burning reactions, she will be attacking slower. She won't be getting these extra attacks quickly. And what I was testing was how good she was compared to Collei. And we spent quite a lot of time testing this on stream. I think what you can say is Emilie is easier to play than Collei, similar to the way how Dendro Traveler is easier to play than Collei. But Emilie bringing in her personal damage and having high uptime compared to someone like Dendro Traveler, where you have to worry about batterying them and using their burst. This made Emilie a pretty good option, and I think she felt pretty good and smooth to play in chamber 1, the AoE multi-wave chamber. Wasn't quite as fast or optimal as Collei, because Collei has very good Dendro application with her sacrificial bow and constellations, and she has the team buffs. So Collei is still better in AoE, but Emilie wasn't that bad. The main difference though is in single target, and in single target you really do notice that extra Dendro application that Collei gives. Or you could play a triple Hydra team that also has good single target. And yeah, in those situations, honestly, I found Emilie falls behind. But to be fair, playing Nilou in single target, it can be really good if you're good at the game. But I think most people focus on Nilou teams in AoE. So if that's the case, then you could easily justify playing Emilie. And her being very easy to play with high skill uptime, it can make for just this very smooth experience. So this is a team I could recommend. As long as you know it probably isn't as optimal for damage compared to using Collei or using Farina or using Xingqiu. She'll fall behind those teams, but I think being just behind those but ahead of some others still puts her in a very good position, and she can be decent to play. The one thing to pay attention to in the Nilou Bloom teams is because you can't use this unfinished Reverie set because you don't have burning, and you're probably using Deepwood Memories on Nahida already. One thing you guys can look into is using Golden Troop. You can either use Golden Troop on Nahida and then give Emilie Deepwood Memories, or I guess you could also try Golden Troop on Emilie and then still keeping Deepwood Memories on Nahida. Although Golden Troop on Nahida should be more damage overall, Nahida's AoE also makes her more consistent at activating Deepwood Memories, which you absolutely don't want to be messing around with your uptime on these res shred buffs. But you can experiment and see what works better for you. I was also testing these quick swap Emilie teams, where you play Emilie with Xiangling and Bennett, and you either play Farina or you play Kazuha. I tested both of them, and to be honest, both of these were okay. Kazuha's grouping being very nice in the AoE, whereas Farina was also pretty decent for Unga Bunga. But I do have to say, using these teams, especially if you don't have a signature weapon like me, it kind of just felt like one of those okay quick swap teams. It didn't really feel like anything special, but these could be fun to play, I guess, if you want to play Emilie on field. I just think these teams just didn't really compare to playing a proper on-fielder. I was also looking at these quick burn teams, specifically with Clorinde. The idea behind these is supposed to be that you're getting Emilie's buff damage from burning, whilst also still getting quicken damage for your electro DPSs. And I was comparing them versus Clorinde's quicken team. To be honest though, these teams kind of felt fun to play, but they clearly got blown out by Clorinde's normal teams. Not only are you losing out on Kazuha's grouping in the AoE floors, but even against Magokenki, this quick burn team stood no chance compared to this. You might find it a fun team to play though. I guess it's kind of like a scuffed version of Chevreuse teams. So if you don't have Chevreuse, you're basically playing Emilie instead of Chevreuse, and it's still an okay team. It just was not at all optimal compared to Clorinde's quicken teams or overload teams. Lastly, I do want to discuss future potential. I do think Emilie is very similar to Chevreuse in the sense of, let's be honest, the game has been out for years and we still haven't got direct replacements for Xiangling and Bennett. And I know other people might have high expectations, but for me, I think it's unlikely we will see direct replacements. And at least for now, we've had characters like Chevreuse or Emilie, where under specific circumstances and team cores, these characters have improved quality of life that you'd expect from a modern Bennett or a modern Xiangling. And why I'm saying this is because, as we know, Chevreuse only ran once on a banner with Raiden back in 4.3. And then Hoyoverse banished her to the dungeons. And then everyone who didn't get her, and then you end up playing DPSs like Arlecchino, Lini, Clorinde, Raiden. You can end up with the biggest FOMO, and that you can't play these specific playstyles without Chevreuse, who you didn't manage to get. Now, I don't want you guys to have FOMO. Obviously, never feel like you have to pull on characters you don't want. That's not what I'm saying, but all I'm saying is Emilie is kind of the first character that's even remotely built around burning or even burgeon, and she does occupy this space by herself. It's free real estate. Although I don't find her best in slot in many current teams, she still has this real estate, and there's a good chance she keeps this niche to herself in the future. They might not develop new supports to go with burning or burgeon. And with the pyro region coming up, I don't want to be in a situation where, let's say, out of the 10 or so DPSs that will come next year, I really like the design of this DPS or that DPS, and I happen to main one of those characters, and then they work really well with Emilie. They did this with Kazuha back in 1.6. It took him like a year for him to rerun after he synergized well with all these Inazuma DPSs. There was kind of a similar thing with Yelan, working really well with Hyper Bloom and Bloom in Sumeru. And again, I'm not saying give in to FOMO, I'm just saying Emilie occupies a valuable niche and it is a possibility. But hopefully this video showed you guys that, at least for now, she really isn't that amazing, although I really do like her design and I think she's good. I think there is a difference between a character being good and a character being best in slot. But you might also like the flexibility, the fact that she is pretty good and a good option in a bunch of different teams. That could be a benefit, and that could be more valuable than her being the outright best option in like 1 or 2 teams. But hopefully you guys found this video helpful. I will be making a bunch more videos on Emilie testing out teams. So yeah, you guys can look forward to that, and thanks for watching.